Bible itself mentions several texts that do not make it into the canon. We won't read those now, but you can look them up later. The book of the Wars of the Lord, the book of Jashar, the book of the book of the deeds of Israel's kings. We don't know what they were. No idea. They're not extant books, and they're probably not going to show up in any caves along the Dead Sea. But you begin to see that there's a lot of stuff out there. The Protestants have 39 books in the Old Testament. We have 27 books in the New Testament. But the difference is that Catholics have 46 books. You probably knew that, right? Catholics have a longer Bible. And eventually those names got called, or the names of those books got called the Apocrypha by Martin Luther. Hidden books. Martin Luther would say doubtful books. You know, they're okay to read, but they're not necessarily on par with the canonical books that we have. I'm going to say about that more in a minute. The order of the books of the Bible varies from one tradition to another. The last book of the Hebrew Bible is 2 Chronicles, which ends with King Cyrus of Persia announcing that he would build a new temple and inviting all Jews to go back home to Palestine. Why would the Hebrews end their Bible that way? They divided it up into the law, the prophets, and then the writings. And 2nd Chronicles were, 1st and 2nd Chronicles were part of the writings, like Psalms and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Why would you end with them going back home from exile? What do you think? What would be the hope when you're heading back home from exile?
Everything's the way it was when you left.
That everything was the way it was you left, or there was a promise that it would be made new again. When they left, Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the temple and basically ruined Jerusalem, flattened Jerusalem, and then all of a sudden Cyrus came from Persia, conquered Babylon, and said, you can go back home again. And so they were going to go back home, and they were going to rebuild their temple, hopefully. And so really, you're gonna close the thing with Jerusalem and the possibility that they would have the temple rebuilt. That would be their hope.
Live happily ever after.
And they would live happily ever after. That works.
End of story.
End of story. But the Christians don't organize the Bible that way. In contrast, Christians place the prophetic book last, so that the Old Testament ends with the promise that Elijah the prophet would appear before the day of the Lord arrived. Malachi 4, 5, and 6. You can look that up at home. What's that about? Elijah reappearing. How does that show up in the New Testament? Do you remember? Who's the Elijah figure when the New Testament shows up? You know? John the Baptist. John the Baptist. So John the Baptist is going to come. He's going to be a forerunner announcing God's messenger. So if you read Malachi, it's all about that messenger who's coming. And that will be John the Baptist. And he will announce the day of the Lord that's coming. So you can see we have a different emphasis. That's why we have a different order for our Old Testament. The text of the Hebrew Old Testament was not fixed until approximately AD 90 in Jamnium. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, was more fluid and included extra books. These extra books, such as Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, and Sirach, account for the difference between the Catholic Bible and the Protestant Bible. Okay? There's a lot of fluidity in terms of which books were going to be included. Again, they didn't start out to write a Bible or even to collect the Bible. But as they collected books, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation, had a different group of them. And so that's why the Catholics have more. We're not better than they are. They're not better than us. We're just different. We're just different. In the 16th century, Martin Luther placed these extra books in an apocrypha, which means hidden. Luther granted that these books were useful to read, but denied that they could establish true teaching. He especially was troubled because the medieval church tied the idea of purgatory to the book 2nd Maccabees 12, 43 through 45. Anybody have an apocrypha in their Bible? If you don't, that's okay, but I'll look it up and read it for you, and you can get some sense of why this would bother Martin Luther. not knocking Catholics when I read this stuff, okay? So, 2 Maccabees 12. I'll just read these verses and you can tell me what you hear. 2 Maccabees 12, 43 through 45. He, Judas Maccabees, took up a collection, man by man, for the amount of 2,000 drachmas of silver, and sent it to Jerusalem to provide for a sin offering. In doing this, he acted very well and honorably, taking account of the resurrection. So notice, this is newer than the Old Testament, so now they're talking about resurrection. They have martyrs around. That's especially why they're talking about resurrection. Those martyrs will take place in the resurrection. For if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. But if he was looking to the splendid reward that is laid up for those who fall asleep in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Therefore he made atonement for the dead, so that they might be delivered from their sin. So here's Martin Luther thinking, okay, these dead people, Judas Maccabees is making a sacrifice for them. And that might give them a chance to participate in the resurrection just yet. And Luther got purgatory out of that, and so did some Catholics. So that's why, one of many reasons why Luther discounted them. The first Christians proclaimed Jesus' death and resurrection and passed on his teachings by word of mouth. Occasionally, people like Paul sent pastoral letters to the congregations. As time passed, and some of the apostles started dying, there was a move to preserve the apostles' teaching. Gospels were written, also the book of Acts. I mean, remember, it's AD 70, the temple was destroyed again, Jerusalem was destroyed in the Jewish-Roman War, and then all of a sudden, Jesus isn't returning. I mean, I think there was a thought that Jesus would return soon, and they waited, and they waited, and they waited, he didn't return. So after a while, there's a need, more of a need, to write things down and have books that can be available to teach the faith to people. And you had some heresies that were starting to develop, some false teachings. So you can understand the need to have order or a rule. These are the criteria that were used to determine which books would be included. Rooted in the apostolic tradition, written or connected with an apostle, like Matthew, known for their Catholicity or universality. In other words, they had relevance for a wider audience than originally intended. They were considered orthodox, were consistent with the teaching of the apostles, tried very hard to be faithful to what Jesus and the 12 disciples had passed down. And they were used in sacred liturgy, in other words, in the church and in hymns and in poems and other things that were written. It was a fluid process, but the basic question for all of them was, did it create faith in the church or not? So there you get some sense. There's some other things that are part of that, and Martin Luther questioned some of the books even in his day, but eventually the original 27 books that were fixed somewhere around the 4th century have stuck with the canon. If we find new books today that are really, really good books, they're probably still not going to make it into the New Testament. The can's closed. Okay? So if you're traveling to Israel and you happen to find some really old books, they're not going to make it in today. But they certainly might stand side by side as something we could study and learn from. Okay? Does that make sense? Any questions on that?
So when we say the Apostles' Creed, it's the Catholic.
The Holy Catholic Church?
Yeah. And that means
universal.
Yes, universal.
Yeah, and the move from Christian to Catholic was used because Catholic is more inclusive. What about the Old Testament? They're not Christians, but they're still God's people. So that's just a more universal way of talking about who God's people are from all times and all places. So that's why that move got made. Rich, did you have a question?
Yeah, the Apocrypha, when exactly were those books eliminated? Is when Martin Luther created, when he translated the Bible?
When were the other books eliminated? That's a great question, and I'm just going to put it this way. In terms of the books that are in the Bible, a vote was never taken. Did you ever read the Da Vinci Code?
Yeah.
The Da Vinci Code got this all wrong. They could not have been more wrong about all this stuff. But somewhere around 367, you've heard of Athanasius, right? Athanasius was the Bishop of Alexandria. And he mentioned the 27 books in the New Testament, and he mentioned these in a letter. And those are the exact same books that we have today. Nobody voted, nobody decided, but based on the things that we talked about here, especially their usage and how they created faith in the church, then eventually that just got settled. They just became the norm, the rule, the canon. So there was never an official vote for the Old Testament or the New Testament.
So
Which kind of, I think, surprises us, doesn't it? It's surprising that somewhere along the way they didn't take a vote and say yes or no. But I think there was enough fluidity along the way where even somebody like Martin Luther, and what became so important for Luther was that these books have to point to Jesus. And he just doesn't see James as pointing to Jesus. So he had trouble with Hebrew and James and Jude and even Revelation because he thought the picture of Jesus in Revelation was so harsh. But eventually Luther agreed with those 27 too. He just put the books he didn't like in the back. Is what Luther did.
So then how did the
Maybe
books
nobody will ever get to them.
how did the books of the Apocrypha get into the Catholic Bible then?
Well, you know that Septuagint that was around? You know, because they were in the Septuagint, right? The Greek translation of the Bible?
Yeah.
I know we're covering a lot of ground here today, but the Septuagint was the basis of the Vulgate. The Vulgate was the first Latin translation. It was done in the 4th century, and they translated from the Greek, not from the Hebrew. And so, since they had those 7 extra books, that got included in the Vulgate. Eventually, the Vulgate became the normative translation of the Roman Catholic Church. That's why.
I guess what I'm kind of struggling with here is it appears that going way back to the 4th or 5th century that there were 2 versions of the Bible. It goes back that far.
Well, 2 versions, but you're not in the Eastern Orthodox.
No.
And the Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox have even more books in their Bibles. Yeah. Just shows you that there's no right answer here. But over time, we've come to accept the 39 books of the Old Testament and the 27 books of the New, and there's some definite historical reasons why we did. That doesn't make us better, just different.
Are you ever concerned that we study so many different forms of the Bible today that sometimes you lose something in translation? Is it ever a concern?
Well, that's why, I mean, you could even argue here, why would you translate from a Greek version when really the Hebrew is the original? So this is a translation of a translation. Yeah. But that's why it's good to read those things we were talking about earlier, find out about the biases of yours. We have so many study Bibles today that you can certainly compare with other versions of Scripture and get a sense. I'm not trying to denigrate Scripture in any way when I do this. It's just important that we realize that it's not easy to translate the Bible. It's not easy to come to some sort of normative text that we can all read and agree on together. I mean, we haven't even gotten into things like textual criticism because, I'm not trying to run down the Bible in any way when I say this, but we have, I think it's like 7,000 manuscripts that have all or part of the New Testament in them, and there's slight variations in almost all those manuscripts. You know, because copiers, they make mistakes. They come around and they, you know, sometimes there's the word in one sentence and the word in the other, and they'll jump from one to the other and they'll leave out all the words. So sometimes it's easy to figure out why they make mistakes along the way. There's a whole school of interpretation that works on standardizing that text as much as they can. And we can be fairly confident because the scribes were really very faithful to try to keep those texts as close to the original as they could. So I don't think we have to be afraid.
No, I'm not, but I mean, an old Norwegian gentleman said to me, Mary Jane, Mary Jane, whenever you start reading and changing the Bible, he was afraid that we would lose something.
Yeah. Well, the risk is always there. We've run over time. Thank you for being patient. Read on about the authority of Scripture. We can talk about that more next time. Go in peace. Create a place where all belong.